20, in 2022, my daughter and her partner wanted to show me an old flint building that they passed every day on their way home from their work. They're both artists and they work at the art studios in Anglia Square. And they really like Anglia Square. They find it really interesting. They love the HMSO building. But they're also extremely curious by this building as well, which seemed to be almost in a wasteland of rather nondescript other buildings, lots of just a kind of a car park on the bare earth practically. And it seemed so strange that there was this really big development and then there was something else beside it which looked as though it had just been abandoned. And we also felt, looking at it, that it was a building that was worth exploring. Um, I should say that I nearly went to university at UEA and I was really, really tempted by their landscape history programme. But I was lured away by going to Warwick because I had the chance of going to Venice for a term. And in Venice, I went to lots of wonderful Italian churches. And as I brought my children up, I took them around lots of churches. And so they are interested in medieval buildings, churches, architecture, all that kind of stuff. So there they were. My daughter and her partner were really interested in this. And they asked me as an archivist to see and a historian to see if we could work out something about it. So we worked together in libraries and archives. And that was quite interesting for me to see how enthusiastic they were about entering my world and how, in a sense, how challenging they found it, but also how much they appreciated the help that they got from people, say, at the Norfolk Record Office, who were really, really good in pointing us in the right direction. And if you've not been to an archive ever, always ask for help because we always know as archivists that it's really quite difficult and not obvious what to do sometimes. We're there to help. Anyway, we got some ideas and then we started kind of floating them around people in Norwich. And I came back to London to continue working in the archives and looking at the various things we'd found. And they got in touch with various building historians, of whom Sandy Heslop came along to have a look at this building. And he was a bit doubtful at first, but then he started to get intrigued. Next slide, please. Before we start, who was St. Olaf? Well, he was a Norwegian. He was a Viking. He fought the Danes in this country, helped the people of London fight off an invasion which would have potentially destroyed London. And as a result, he was really quite popular in both London and the east of England. He became King of Norway and eventually was killed and became a martyr. He often appears, if you find a Tooley Street anywhere in the country, it's more than likely that there was once a St. Olave collection there, because the name, like St. Etheldreda became Audrey, St. Olaf became Tooley. He was martyred in 1030, and there's two churches in Norwich, probably named after him, which were probably consecrated soon afterwards. So these are before 1066, so we can call them late Saxon churches. The illustration here comes from a psalter which was actually in Norwich for a very long time at Carrow Abbey. And it's now somewhere in Minnesota, but it's a really, really beautiful piece of work, far grander than anything else we're going to see. Next, please. Now this is my daughter's journey home. This is the studios in Gildencroft House. If you walk along this very, very long passageway, there's lots of studios on either side, 80 artists busy beavering away. Next, please. And you get these rather fantastic views. You can see it's a building not in very good condition. The glass in the windows is not great, and that one's kind of, you get a lovely clear view of the sky, and then there's a bit where the glass has gone funny. But between the car park and Sovereign House, you can see a glimpse through to a much older set of buildings, much lower set of buildings. And it's down through that area that we're going to go. Next, please. There you go, an aerial view. So you've got Gildengate House with the circle around it. You can see a bit of the old street plan, the flyover that Maria was just talking about. You can see Magdalen Street. You can see over to the other side, Pitt Street. And you can see Botolph Street going down the side of Sovereign House, and the car park I just mentioned, and then a cluster of buildings at the bottom, or at the top of the screen. Next, please. And this here you can see the physical remains of Botolph Street. You can see that it's still, in a sense, cobbled. Bits of derelict land have been used to turn into a car park, and then a bit further down, just in front of what was the Surrey Chapel, and I think it's now called another chapel, you can see this flint building. It's flint. It's been encased in some form of render at the bottom. You can see that it's roughly the size of a smallish church. You can see that it's got a bit of a possibly a northern extension on the north side, and it's very definitely oriented east-west. So it's pretty much the size of a church. It's pretty much in the direction you expect a church to be. And we know from various bits of research that we've done that it's in an area which was called St. Olaves Churchyard for 800 years. Next, please. This is an overhead view, obviously. The building we're talking about has got a new roof, so it's that one with the kind of like the reddish roof with a star on it. You can see Pitt Street, which was sometimes called Tooley Street. You can see Botolph Street, which was sometimes called Middle Street or St George's Street. These names seem to go in and out for Botolph or Middle or St George's Street. There doesn't seem to be any time when it's absolutely fixed. And then along the bottom, there was a place called Cherry Lane, or sometimes called Cherry Tree Lane or Cherry Alley. You can't actually see it now because the Surrey Chapel's been built over it, but you can see over towards the underneath Sovereign House. You can see it just starts to say Cherry Lane, so it was on that level. It went all the way across. And this is a plot of land which we got interested in. And although I know you're expecting to hear about building history, to some extent what I'm going to be talking about is the history of this plot. And I was quite surprised at how much we were able to find out, how much it has changed over time, and yet how much it's changed as it stayed as a single plot of land. Next, please. One of the first things we did was to look online, obviously, and we found an archaeological evaluation from 2010, which we thought would be a great place to start. It's a really detailed report by Heather Wallace. It goes into great depth, much more than I can understand about archaeology, but it doesn't really look at the building history or the archives. And so I've shifted the image over slightly so you can see the roundabout on the, is it the Inner Ring Road? And on St Crispin's Road. Next, please. And this is what she wrote. St Olaves Church, they were looking at the whole of the car park area as well, but this bit here was called Area 7. The trenches within Area 7 sought to investigate the possible location of St Olaves Church. Little is known about this church, although the dedication to St Olav must postdate the canonisation of Olav, King of Norway, in 1035. Documentary evidence tells us that the church fell into decline after the Black Death in 1348, and that it was no longer in use by 1546, when it was consolidated with St George Coalgate. And that's coming from the famous work of Bloomfield, which was published in 1806, an absolute classic work for the history of Norfolk and Norwich. She continues, the exact location of the church is not known. Campbell suggested it may be located under the present Surrey Chapel, whilst the Ordnance Survey marks its location as being beneath the Pitt Street roundabout. And this seems to me to be, really quite definite. Unfortunately, yes, they're investigating a churchyard, but the church no longer exists. It's under the Pitt Street roundabout, and we're not going to find anything. Next, please. I couldn't find which Ordnance Survey map she was looking at, but the 1906 map shows a city block with no information about any chapel within the area of the yard of the plot. You can see the building there. It's that one right in the middle underneath where it says Cherry Tree Yard, a kind of a squarish rectangle. There is a chapel down to the southeast, which I do wonder whether people thought might have been ended up under the roundabout. But we discovered this is a Baptist chapel, a much later one, and it's got nothing to do with St. Olaves as a church. Next, please. Anyway, this is some of the things that she said. The southern part of the development area was thought to have been the site of St. Olave's Church. Although the church was not located, 3 of the trenches contained burials, indicating that this area lay within the graveyard of St. Olave's. And they found graves of 10 people. So 4 graves, which were Middle to Late Saxon in Trench 14, just on one side of the building. 1 skeleton with no side of a cut grave, a bit in Trench 16. And then 5 graves of 4 adults and a child in Trench 17 to the south of the building. These were all left in place and they're still there. And when this area was going to be developed by Western Homes, the idea was that they would stay there because piles were going to be driven through, and apparently that doesn't disturb graves in the way that foundations would do. A foundation would do. I'm not quite sure that I think this is a good idea. One of the things I've put in some of these pictures is these little stars which indicate the outlines of a plot that we learnt to recognise. And it's a plot which has got the Pitt Street side, the Cherry Lane side, the Botolph side, and then along the top we learnt that it didn't have a roadway, it just backed onto people's gardens in other plots. But it's a slightly strange shape. It's a squarish kind of rectangle, but it's got a dent in one side. And we learnt to recognise this as something which exists in all the various maps that we've seen going back a long, long time. And I think it's one of the reasons why we can actually claim that we can actually identify this plot over time. Next, please. Going back to the skeletons, you can find out a great deal more about skeletons now than you could even in 2010. It's a great shame, I think, that they reburied them rather than kept them. There's been a fantastic project in Cambridge looking at 500 medieval skeletons, which is rather more than the 10 that we seem to have. But they were able to use something called osteoarchaeology to create bone biographies, and they could tell a great deal about the people's lives and their health and kind of like the work that they did simply by looking at the bones. And they were able they created personalities based on what they were able to tell from the skeletons. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you look up the University of Cambridge Department of Archaeology, you'll find it, and it was fascinating. Next, please. Anyway, the archaeologists thought that the building had been asked to see whether this flint building had perhaps reused the church's foundations, and they came to the conclusion that it didn't. They looked at a trench which was just outside that small door on the south side, and they found that it didn't really have any deep foundations, and that there were dressed limestone pieces which were under the ground, which had been salvaged and reused from an earlier building. These fragments were of architectural work stone, so things like mouldings, inscriptions, small pieces of marble slab, cornstone. So they think that these probably came from St. Olave's Church, and they think also that the flint was probably reused from St. Olave's Church, but that St. Olave's Church was somewhere else, potentially under the roundabout. I also learned a word here that I had never heard before, sondage, which doesn't mean a full digging up a full trench. It means cutting like slices through it. Next, please. We just started looking, first of all, at online sources, maps and photographs. We went to the Norfolk Heritage Centre in the Forum. We went to the Norfolk Record Office. And obviously, I went to work and looked at the National Archives. So we were using a combination of maps and photographs online, including the fantastic George Plunkett collection, lots of published works, property records from the Norfolk Record Office, and Ordnance Survey records and wills at the National Archives. Our wills are online, and there's 11,000 wills from Norwich from about 1394. That's a lot of wills, 1394 up to 1858. Ian, can we move on? Oh, now, thank you. This is a clear map where we're talking about. You can see
I think it appears that Amanda's dropped out from the call. I'll just see whether we can she's perhaps having issues with her internet or something, and I'll investigate that further. Yeah.
Certainly her image on my screen froze when she asked me to change slide. I didn't get that until she repeated it. Is there any way you can contact her, Jess?
Only via email. I'll just pause the recording for now.
we were talking about this map from 1696, which I think shows the plot again, and you can see the road system much more clearly here, so that you can see that in a sense it was part of a long block, kind of it's not by itself, it's not cut off by the ring road now. It was integral with a block which goes down almost to St George Colgate, but not quite. Next, please. So we went and found another map, and this was the 1886 25-inch map of Norwich, the Ordnance Survey map. And this is one which actually shows this plot as containing the site of St Olaves Church. So this is very encouraging for us. And again, you can see the kind of dented rectangle. Next, please. And there's a dented rectangle again. And next, please. This is what I found at the National Archives. There's a set of records called the Object Name Books, which the Ordnance Survey kept. And these record information about all those entries you find on the 25-inch map, which have got things in record type. So when it said St Olave's Churchyard, and they reviewed it every so often. And the person they got to review the Norfolk ones was Walter Rye, who I'm sure you've heard of. Yeah. I was speaking to Chris Kitching about his biography of Walter Rye, and he mentioned him to me, so I knew that this was a name I should know about. But Chris didn't I think know of Walter Rye's work in this, of working with the OS, and I'm not sure how widely this source is known, but I like to plug it because I thought it was extremely interesting. This is just one page, and we've got Walter Rye's comments on Roman urns, the Strangers' Hall, and St Olave's Church, which he's altered to St Olave's Chapel. The thing is, though, that what this book records is not merely the fact that these were recorded on the 25-inch map and why they were recorded and comments about them. What it actually says is for the after 1905, they were left out for want of space. So you might think, looking at the 25-inch 1886 map, that it's there, and the 1906 it's not there. It was wrong, but it's not wrong. They haven't actually withdrawn the idea that that's where it was. They simply haven't put it in for lack of space. And so I do wonder how many of these really this amount of knowledge that people had accumulated over the years and had recorded has got lost from public consciousness simply because it's no longer included in up-to-date maps. It seems a shame. But also we did find it encouraging that that's why it's there. It's not under the what would be the roundabout. It should actually be in this site. Next, please. I was back in London by this, but several Norwich building historians had got involved, and I really wished I'd been able to meet them, but I couldn't. They were busy in Norwich, and I'm afraid I haven't met them, and I don't know everybody's name, so apologies if I leave people out. The only person whose name I do know really is Sandy Heslop, so I'm going to mention him. So we got some really expert advice about the Flint building itself, and there was a detailed application put in for listed building status in 2022, which was unfortunately rejected without allowing access for a full examination. And that's the situation where we are at the moment. A lot of building historians and people who know about parish churches think it is an early church, not a very big church, not a terribly important church, but an interesting church in itself. And we can't actually do the kind of like the building assessment to prove it. But if we, next slide, please. This is the evidence that got put forward in the listing application. So that the churchyard, the plot of the churchyard is approximately 1 acre, which is standard for North Norwich churches. What remains of the church is modest by comparison to other medieval churches. Yeah, it's not grand. It's consistent with churches in Norwich north of the river. The scale, proportion and materiality of the east elevation of the building bears similarity to another medieval church. This is St Edmund's Church on Fishergate, and that's the picture. The location of the door in southeast of the building, which is consistent with the placement of the door in medieval churches across Norwich. I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but it sounds extremely interesting to me, and persuasive too. Next slide, please. And Sandy came and had a look at the building and measured it with my daughter and her partner. And he started to think that, yes, it is the same length as St Augustine's, as St Augustine's was in 1160. He could see that there was a major change in the fabric. I don't know if you can see this. This is looking at the west end. And he could see that there's at the bottom, at the bit that you can see towards the bottom, the flints are blacker and smaller. So he thinks there's a fair chance that the small black ones are part of an early west gable. And the building has obviously been altered since, but there's remains of the church building there. Next, please. Some lucky people managed to get inside, and this is what they said. The surface mortar is cement, but beneath is early lime mortar, buff in appearance and featuring chalk aggregate identical to what's found in early mortars of other city centre churches. And this was translated to me as meaning mud from the Wensum. That's what they use to actually make the mortar. And again, the flints are large and coursed, which is typical for medieval churches in Norwich. So we did feel that there was room for further investigation here, and unfortunately it hasn't taken place. Next, please. The archaeological report from 2010 relied quite heavily on Bloomfield. Francis Bloomfield died in 1752. His books was published in 1806, The History of Norfolk. And this is what he said about it. It's commonly called St Tuli's. This church was appropriated to the Prior of Norwich and settled on the infirmary there. That means that the church belonged to the Prior of Norwich, and any income from it would go to the Great Hospital. It was valued at 13 shillings and fourpence, was served by a parochial chaplain, and in 1289 had an anchorage in the churchyard inhabited by Margaret and Alice, anchoresses there. So they're doing pretty well, I think, to have two anchoresses. I don't know if they were there at the same time, but their names are known. They must have had quite a powerful impact on people to be remembered. In 1501, there was a guild of St Olaf kept there. In 1504, the chancel and church were repaired, and in 1534, it was called a chapel only. I think we can pull a little bit more out of this. The fact that it was a smallish church. It was relatively poor, but it seems to have had quite an active religious life. The fact that there's a guild, this would be a parochial guild. It would be a really social event, a social religious community of secular people who see this as their church, and they would keep festivals there. They would maintain altars there. They would raise money. They in fact raised sufficient money that they were able to repair it in 1504. By 1534, though, it's called a chapel only, and this is the point where I think Bloomfield diverges a little bit in date from what we think actually happened. We think that it became kind of like a chapel of St George Colgate at a slightly earlier period than Bloomfield says. Next, please. So this is what he says, and it sounds worrying. In 1546, it was consolidated to St George in Colgate. The church was demolished and the churchyard afterwards leased out by the Dean and Chapter as it still continues. The churchyard abuts south on St Tullies Lane, now called Cherry Alley. That seems fairly definite. But there's all kinds of slight inconsistencies here with some of the things that he's saying. We know that it was consolidated to St George's earlier than he says. It was treated as a chapel of St George rather than as a parish in itself for quite a long time. And then there's also got this word demolished, which sounds so definite. Next, please. But unfortunately, demolished wasn't used in England until the 1570s. It was a Scottish word. And when it was used, it meant put an end to rather than destroy. Many other Norfolk churches and chapels closed around this time were also referred to as demolished when they weren't necessarily at all. People do not necessarily want to take a building which is in quite good order and knock it down. There's no reason to do it. These churches or chapels reverted to the Dean and Chapter of Norwich. Now, I'm a bit confused about this, and I'd be interested if anybody's got any ideas on it. This is 1546. In 1547, they start closing chantries, and the lands which went to support the chantries go to the Crown. It's a bit of sleight of hand, really. It's the same with the dissolution of the monasteries, where the Crown took all the lands by saying that, oh, we were the original founder, when they weren't necessarily at all. It's a bit Trumpian, I think, in some ways. So there's no actual proof that it was demolished. It may just have been closed. Next, please. Now, the next thing we did was to start looking for leases. This is looking for whatever evidence we can find about what happened to St Olaves churchyard or chapel yard after the church was closed as a church. It's a bit difficult to do because although it belonged to the Dean and Chapter of Norwich, and the Dean and Chapter kept records of their leases, they don't actually survive for this early period. So we had to find records elsewhere. And one of the things we did find, almost the first thing we found, was a lease from 1565, a 99-year lease. And it's mentioned in the Parliamentary Survey of 1649, so it's kind of like a retrospective mention. And this was a lease from the Dean and Chapter to Nicholas Norgate, who was a rich mercer, an alderman, and a mayor of Norwich. And I have to say that this business about being a tradesman, an alderman, and mayor of Norwich crops up again and again in the people that hold this plot of land. It seems to have been something that rich people wanted. It's in the north of Norwich. You know more than I do, but I would be intrigued to know what they were using it for. Nicholas Norgate had two other dissolved churches, All Saints Firebridge and St Margaret Firebridge, also from the Dean and Chapter. So presumably, are they warehouses? Do they have other uses? Does the churchyard itself have a use? Is it a piece of open land in a busy city? We don't actually know how they use them, but I think we can speculate. Anyway, in 1568, only 3 years after getting the 99-year lease, Nicholas Norgate died, and in his will, he left to a nephew. Next, please. This is his will, which is at the National Archives. He left them to his nephew, Stephen Holland, my sister's son. Can you next again? I can read this, but it's a bit small. He left my tenement with the edifyings and appurtenances lying and being in Norwich, next to the dissolved church of St Olave, which one John Evelyn the elder hath of me by lease for 21 years. So we know that there was a house which we think was built by Norgate next to the church and this plot of land, and he's renting it out to somebody called John Evelyn for 21 years. So he is kind of like subdividing the property a bit, but he retains the 99-year lease over the whole thing. Next, please. The next bit we found was from John Kirkpatrick at the Norfolk Record Office. John Kirkpatrick kept immense numbers of notes, and often they're on tiny scraps of paper. And so we routed through a lot of these, trying to make sense of them. They're not the easiest things, but this one says in Latin, The close called St Tolla's churchyard was held by Thomas Norgate in 1573. In 1616 it was in the hands of Anne Layer, widow of Thomas Layer, alderman, who still held it in 1626. So these are quite useful things. We've got 3 names there: Thomas Norgate, Anne Layer, and Thomas Layer, and we've got a period 1573 to 1626. So Thomas Layer was a very wealthy grocer, a sheriff, an alderman, 3 times mayor, and MP for Norwich. He lived in St Andrews, which is very central, and probably he had a big house there, but not necessarily much space. And he had grounds and orchards in St Olaves churchyard. So one of the things I was speculating is, this is like, where do you park your car if you haven't got a garage? Where do you put your horses if you haven't got space in the centre of Norwich to keep them? And somebody who is a sheriff, an alderman, 3 times mayor, and an MP is probably going to have quite a few horses. So perhaps the church and the churchyard were actually used for that kind of purpose. Maybe they were used for drying the washing. You need lots of space to dry washing. I don't know what you could do with them, but if you are a man of that wealth and status, I'm sure you could find something to do with it, which will make the life of you and your family and your status in general a bit greater. Next, please. Thomas Layer's grandson was Christopher Jay, who's another well-known Norwich man, alderman, mayor, and MP for Norwich, and builder of the Samson and Hercules house. I'm not sure if I know he lived it there for a short time, but I don't know if he built it. He had a 40-year renewal of the lease in 1664, and this is the first time we actually get to see the lease itself because it's copied into a book by the Dean and Chapter's record keepers. And it says there that he had St Olaves chapel yard, together with a tenement thereon builded, with the stone walls and all other edifices and buildings thereunto belonging, at a rent of 5 shillings to be paid on Lady Day and at Michaelmas, plus either 2 fat hens or 2 shillings to be paid on Dr. Spencer's tomb in the cathedral. This amused me enormously, but it turns out to be that a lot of rents are paid on Dr. Spencer's tomb in the cathedral. I don't think it's still there. I couldn't find it, but this would be Miles Spencer, who was the Chancellor at some point, I believe. So they've got quite a bargain, I think, here. So that's 5 shillings twice a year, plus 2 fat hens or 2 shillings. So for effectively a shilling a month, they've got a very nice property. Next, please. This is something that intrigued me. I'm not really well up on deeds myself, but my colleague Dan Gosling has catalogued hundreds and hundreds of deeds, and he said that it was really unusual phrase, the stone walls. It's not the kind of thing that you normally see in a lease which mentions buildings in detail. And he thought, or properties, he thought it might indicate a de-roofed building, so that perhaps they'd taken the roof off the old church building. And that perhaps the church was being used as a source of building material for new buildings within the yard. Maybe they'd just taken it down a bit. I mean, if you've got a good supply of building material there and you're not needing it all, you might as well use some of it. Which raises another question that you can perhaps answer for me in the questions, is where does all this flint come from? The vast quantities of flint in Norwich. How does it get there? Next question, please. Next slide, please. Anyway, the Dean and Chapter continue to record the issue of leases. They're issuing quite long leases, so they don't crop up regularly, but you know to jump forward 50 years or whatever when you're looking in these books. And they use the same description of the property throughout. We know it became a brewery from at least the 1730s because John Boyes has it as a beer brew, it's not, sorry, I've got tangled up there. We know it was leased by brewers. It was not used as a brewery. Okay. But it seems to have been used for storage or perhaps for the horses, the dray horses, etc., that would be needed. So first of all, it was John Boyes, then it became the Weston family, with Charles Weston being another mayor of Norwich. The Weston Brewery itself was at the closed church St Margaret at Newbridge, which had also become incorporated into St George Colgate. Next, please. But in 1782 there was a new lease agreed, and it was almost exactly the same, except this time it mentioned a tenement, stable, and storehouse thereupon builded with the stone walls and all other the edifices. So we know that my interpretation of this is that the old church had been converted to actual stables and that other buildings were also there. In 1864, the chapel yard was sublet to Young's, Crawshay and Young's, who were an even larger firm of Norwich brewers. You can see why they might need stables. The delivery of beer around Norwich, the bringing in of the raw materials. You can see that they've got to have somewhere to keep the horses. Next slide, please. Just have a quick look at some of other churches which were converted to warehouses and things like this. This is St Bartholomew Bear Street, which was converted to a warehouse and used for practically another 400 years until it was demolished in 1939. Next, please. Some other activity that's going on in Pitt Street, and I put this in because everything has been black and white so far, and I wanted you to see some colour. At the National Archives, we've got over 400 registered designs for 19th century Norwich shawls, and very many of them were designed in Pitt Street and made in Pitt Street. And I catalogued these about 15 years ago, so I just wanted to show off a bit so that you can find some marvellous things at the National Archives which relate specifically to some of Norwich's wonderful industries. Next, please. And then later it was redeveloped as building land. So this is the 1870s. And the dean and chapter are selling it. And this is the first time that it actually leaves the hands of the church since the 1030s or so, when it became into the hands of the church. They're selling it, the church commissioners are selling it to raise money to augment poor livings. So we now have a cherry tree yard coming in from Pitt Street, which was never there before. There's houses built to the north and the south. So along Cherry Tree Lane now has houses on that side, where it previously only had houses on the other side, we think. The Cherry Tree pub was relocated from St George's Street, where it was pretty much opposite the Dent, to the bottom corner on the other side on Pitt Street. But the stables were not sold. They were kept by the brewers. Next, please. So by the time we get to this map, which when I first looked at it, I thought this is an old map, so showing old things, I now realise that it's showing actually a whole set of buildings which are only 10 years old, which was quite unexpected to me, quite a jolt, really. Next, please. From 1878, we get the stable building being converted into an early petrol station, which I think was extraordinary. They leased the stable building, they converted it to a warehouse for paints, oils and petrol, installed oil tanks, and they developed the north side with the cantilever roof as a display area. So it was a bit like a combination of a petrol station and home base. They were selling all kinds of wonderful Victorian contraptions on this new display area. Next, please. And this is a map which Ian has just provided for me, which I think is absolutely interesting. It's the same map, it's the 25-inch map from 1885, 1886, and you can see just how crammed full of buildings North Norwich is. It's absolutely stuffed. The population density must be really high, and it would be fascinating to look at the censuses to see who's living in these places from 1851 onwards. It was something we didn't do, and I regret now that we didn't do it, but it's still there to be done. Ian, what's the bit that's the bit at the top there, the circle, that is in Olaves churchyard, isn't it? The green bit. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Just unmuting myself.
Yeah.
The red circle shows St Olaves churchyard.
Churchyard, yeah.
And the green circle here is St Botolph's church, which has
Oh,
also
is it?
disappeared by this time.
Yes, yeah. Yes, there certainly were an awful lot of small parishes in North Norwich. There must have been a real desire to build them as well. There must have been sufficient population to build them when they were first built. So I think, I don't know, but I imagine there's been a good Christian population there for quite a long time. Next, please. This is just some photographs I found. I found this one at the National Archives. It's the Cherry Tree Pub in Pitt Street, and it's very easy to tell because it's got like a faceted corner with these reticulate. This is that reticulation? Is that what it's called around the windows? And it's a day out, which I thought was lovely. It looks so cheerful in comparison to some of the pictures we might see. So this is 1896, so the pub's probably been there for about 20 years, and they're all off for a day out at Great Yarmouth. Next, please. This is the kind of picture which looks rather dour. It all looks kind of like black and dismal, and I'm sure it wasn't. I think it's just probably rather dirty buildings from smoke. This is one of George Plunkett's wonderful photographs of Pitt Street looking north, and you can see the Cherry Tree Pub again from the kind of faceted entrance there. And then a bit further up, you can see the entrance to the new Cherry Tree Yard, which was built in the 1870s. So that block with the Cherry Tree Pub is from the 1870s. This bit nearer us is much older. Next, please. This is the south side of Cherry Lane, again in the 1930s. You can see that these are quite a variety of buildings. It looks to me as though some are possibly 17th century, some are 19th century, some 18th century. I couldn't find a really good photograph of Cherry Lane itself, of the bit that was developed in the 1870s, but we've got a bit of a glimpse in a little while. Next, please. Now this in the 1950s, the building that we think was the church, the Flint building, the stables, was sold, and it went to a variety of working owners who used it for all kinds of purposes, as storage, etc. Then it went to developers, and now it's in the hands of Norwich Council. You can see there the buildings that were built, the houses that were built. You can see the Cherry Tree with its faceted front. You can see the buildings along Cherry Lane, and you can see the houses up St George Street. Next, please. And you can see them again in the 1950s here. So you can get a glimpse of the houses that were built along Cherry Lane on the south side of the plot, north side of the lane. You can see the roof, and that looks like an older roof to me. That was before of the stables, before it was re-roofed. And you can also see there's not a great deal of room in there for any archaeology. So most of these buildings were, apart from the houses, were still here when the archaeology took place in 2010. And you can also see that work is going on in Pitt Street. It looks as though they're mending the road. Next, please. And that's the Pitt Street frontage now, light and bright and pretty much left by itself and Pitt Street. And the Cherry Tree Pub is still there, but it's not a pub any longer. Next, please. And this is the last slide, and it's probably the last glimpse of some of these buildings. This was taken in 1991. You can see the stable building, the church, before a factory was built in front of it. You can see Sovereign House, you can see a bit of Gilden Gate House, and we're expecting Gilden Gate and the rest of Anglia Square for demolition to be starting within weeks, because my daughter and my partners are among the 85 artists who've just been told to leave the building on a month's notice, and they are not here today because they've been busy moving everything out. So that's where we are now.
Right. So that's definite, is it, Amanda? They've actually got a date for the demolition of Anglia Square, have they?
People in Ernest Zero Waste were saying they've been told that they are going to be out within some weeks. They're talking about spring demolition. There's vans going around looking at everything, working out how to do it. So yes, we think it's going to be quite soon.
Oh, the end of an era. Okay, well, it's fascinating, these little details that you've been digging out. You and your daughter and your family have really made it into a sort of personal pilgrimage almost to find out more about St Olaves Church. I think we have one or two questions probably before we wrap up. Jess, have we got hands up?
No hands up, but oh yes, we've got one from Brian Ayres. Oh, hopefully I've pronounced your surname correctly. Okay. There we go.
Amanda, thank you very much for that very, very interesting talk. Sandy had very kindly provided me with a copy of the report you wrote back in 2022, which gave us a great deal to think about. If I could throw in one or two little things. Firstly, I think you're really probably very correct that building was at least part of the church. And at the very least that ought to happen with any development is that the render should be taken off. A very close examination of the building should be made, and that some excavation should take place within the building.
Yes.
And I'm encouraged in a way to see that it was a garage with oil tanks, because the very least they're going to have to do is to empty out the oil tanks very carefully and remove any pollution, which means that one would get 3 sections or sondages, this lovely word we discovered, going through the soil. So that would be very useful. The other interesting thing I think that needs to be brought out is why the church is there in the first place. And that, I think, comes down to the dedication, which, as you mentioned, is St. Olaf of Norway, who was a royal saint.
Yes.
And the location of that building, and indeed the other St. Olaf, which was probably just a chapel rather than ever parochial on King Street, is particularly interesting. The parish boundary of St. Olaf, as far as we can gather from looking at the enrolled deeds of Norwich of the late 13th century and early 14th century, the parish boundary to the east appears to have been the line of the Anglo-Scandinavian defences running up St. George's Street and Calvert Street. So
really?
it was actually located immediately outside the Anglo-Scandinavian defensive enclosure. As a royal saint, one of the interesting things about St. Olaf is that work in London by Pamela Nightingale has suggested that such dedications may well have taken place in areas where the king wanted the church, as it were, to act as almost a gate guardian to help to safeguard approaches to the community. That could be seen with pretty well all 5 of the St. Olafs in London. You could see it with people coming up the Wensum on King Street. And again, you could see them approaching the Anglo-Scandinavian enclosure from the north and west by positioning where it is. The other thing about the foundation, and you mentioned that it belonged to the dean and chapter, ultimately, originally to the cathedral priory, which the first reference, I think, is 1254, something like that, is how the cathedral got it in the first place. And of course, we don't know that because the early documentation does not survive. But the probability, I'd suggest, is either it's royal, i.e. it's being founded by the king as a gate guardian, or it could be episcopal, because the Anglo-Saxon bishop who first canonized Olaf, and it was done locally in Norway, and it wasn't finally approved by the Pope until about 150 years later, was a man called Grimkatell. And he was Bishop of Nidaros, which was Trondheim. But then he came back to Britain, to England, and very shortly, only for about 3 years, he was Bishop of East Anglia. And so he may have been behind the founding of the church. All predates the cathedral priory, of course, which is later in the 11th century. And that might be why it then passed on to Norwich Cathedral, or the king gave it to Norwich Cathedral. And the final little point about that is the stonework that you were mentioning. Firstly, of course, the flint is excavated within Norwich, whole series of flint mines under the city. But you mentioned the Cairn stone.
Yeah.
Cairn stone, of course, in Norwich is being used on a royal building, which is Norwich Castle, and it's been used on a major episcopal building, which is Norwich Cathedral, or on churches associated with the cathedral. And there's some Cairn stone, for instance, on St Mary Coslany, which is not very far away from where you are. So all that, I hope, provides a bit more context for the church and emphasizes just how significant it was. It was a very small church, quite poor, as you said, because it didn't have a large estate or parochial area, but it had a status, an early status, which disappears as the Middle Ages goes on. And so if elements of that church do survive within that building, we really do need to look at it.
How do we do it?
Through the
How does
planning
it
process.
happen?
Through the planning process. If there's going to be a major development there, one of the things that the consultant archaeologists need to do is to liaise very closely with the local planning authority and make sure there's a planning application, a planning condition, which is put on any planning consents which are granted by the city council.
So you think there's hope that it might happen, that investigation might happen?
I should jolly well hope so.
Yeah, that would be great if it did.
Unfortunately, I don't live in Norwich anymore, so it's...
Yeah. But looking at the old street plan itself, it seems to be so much more humane. Looking at the population density and the map that Ian showed, it would be great to have a kind of like low-scale development at high population density on an old street plan, I think.
Couldn't agree more.
I think
I
Penny's...
didn't know,
Oh, sorry, Amanda. You
I
had
didn't
a
know
further
about
comment.
I just didn't know about the flint mines under Norwich. That's extremely interesting. So.
We live on an escarpment which is tunnelled for flint. Rather worried recently because we've had water pouring out of drains and so on. We're worried that they're going to create sinkholes underneath our houses.
Oh.
Yes, I mean, Norwich is a city of chalk and flint, and that's very important building material, of course. Any more questions? Thank you, Brian, very much to bring your expertise in. That was a treat. Thank you.
Thank you.
It really was. It was extremely interesting, especially about the gift of the Cairn stone. You think it's a gift?
Well, I mean, if it's in the ownership of the cathedral, and we certainly know it is by the 13th century, and it's probably considerably earlier. There's no reason why dressed stone of that quality shouldn't come from the cathedral workshops.
Yeah, as a sign of approval of ownership, almost.
And yes, and it's costly stuff to import.
Yeah.
Penny Clark, I think you've come off mute. Did you have a question for Amanda?
No.
Okay, no, just wanted to check.
The St Olaves Hart Street in the City of London still keeps up the Danish connection, because when it was sort of rededicated, I suppose, after the repair and rebuilt of the bomb damage, King Haakon was there, and there is a memorial stone to that effect. So
that's nice.
Just on the chat, Anna Allison says, interesting that St Olaves is associated with gateways and that St Botolph Street is nearby. St Botolph is also associated with entrance routes, gates into villages and towns.
I do have a question myself, and it's this constant running of cherries throughout the whole place, and also that dent in the rectangle. Do you think I'm being ridiculous in thinking that possibly there was some kind of famous cherry tree there at some point? Maybe at the Dent. Maybe the Dent went round the cherry tree.
By Joseph of Arimathea, perhaps.
Yes,
Which is
possibly.
the usual explanation for old trees,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yeah, because there seem to be so many kind of like connotations which carry through. Either the churchyard had cherry trees, or potentially there was a significant tree around the place.
There are at least 2 other churches in the city which had trees associated with them. St. Martin at Oak is very nearby. It's almost adjacent. And it had an image of the Virgin Mary in the tree, apparently, until the
Oh, did it?
Reformation.
Yeah.
And then there's St. Michael at Thorn that was bombed in 1942, which stood
Yeah.
at the top of Thorn Lane off Burr Street, and
Yes.
presumably had a major thorn tree within it.
Yeah. So it's not like in the dedication, but it's always known as, you know, Cherry Lane, Cherry Alley, Cherry this, Cherry that.
I think that there might have been a succession. If it wasn't a cherry orchard, there must have been a succession of cherry trees, because they're not especially long-lived trees, unlike the oak that St. Martin at Oak that's just been mentioned.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a succession.
Cherry tree.
Amanda, the word you were looking for the way the treatment around the windows of rustication.
Rustication, of course it was. Yes. Yeah.
And I had.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. You were talking about the deed, which mentions stone walls.
Yes.
I wondered whether that could have just been churchyard walls, because we do have a number, or yep, that was
Yes,
just
but I think they would have been described as kind of like boundary walls, because later they mentioned something about palings, and so that would be like a wooden fence round the boundary instead.
right.
But no, it doesn't. It's not saying that that the walls are boundary walls, or that it's, you know, within the walls or anything like that. It's just what says the stone walls, and it does seem unusual. And as I say, the only one I've seen like it is one for the site of the Blackfriars in Great Yarmouth, which mentions something similar, and that's after the dissolution of the Blackfriars.
Usual in the city, because most of the buildings were timber framed, and after that, then brick became the most obvious. So anything still around in the 17th or 18th century in Flint would have been unusual in that sense. So
Yeah.
was it just describing an unusual building? I mean, obviously it has been built at Flint all its life, but
Yes.
it would have stood out during most of its life. It would have been different from everything around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, you showed us that picture from someone who managed to go inside and have a look. Who owns it? Who owns it, Amanda? I wasn't sure.
Now it's owned by the council. I think the history of who was developing what at when is a bit difficult to tell, because I'm not involved in Norwich local news or anything. I think Western Homes had a tie on it at some point, but whether they owned it or not, I don't know. But it went through kind of like series of people who were using it for light industrial purposes, I think.
So it looked in quite good condition inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's quite a substantial building, and somebody's put a new roof on it, so, you know, obviously thought it was worth maintaining. It's just so strange.
Trying to draw up this drive, but I can't find it. So
yeah.
Did anybody have any further questions for Amanda?
No. It was very interesting.
Thank you. We found it absolutely fascinating to do. It really was like a treasure hunt for us.
Very, very interesting.
I'm sorry your daughter's being thrown out of her studio. And this is happening to a lot of buildings awaiting redevelopment. There are other places in Norwich where there are artist studios. They're promised other places to go, but of course they'll never be as cheap and available.
No, exactly. It's been fantastic for them. It's really allowed them to develop, and you know, she's she's had a fantastic time there, and it's a marvellous community as well, which is all being scattered. But,
so she'll stay in Norwich, presumably, will she?
yes, yeah.
Oh, well, I hope that she continues beavering away into St. Olaves history and
Yes.
perhaps she can find out more about it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is it, probably, folks. Can I just mention, what was it Ian wanted me to mention again? Anybody who pays by standing order, if they're unsure how to pay, to contact Maggie on membership@norwichnhbg.org.uk. Sorry to finish on such a practical note.
Mary, the address you read out was wrong.
Oh, right.
Membership@nhbg.org.uk.
That's what I said, yes.
You added a Norwich in there.
Did I? I do beg your pardon.
And it's for people who don't pay by standing order. For those that do pay by standing order, we hope the bank will actually cough up. Not that they always do on time, but people tend to forget year on year whether they pay automatically or have to pay each time each year comes up. So Maggie can answer their questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyway, on that practical note, can we all unmute ourselves and thank Amanda by the usual way of applause? And thank you so much. It's been a fascinating evening, and I shall go and explore myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was very interesting.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.